Welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me to speak. And I am going to be almost a little bit more formal than I sometimes am, if you can believe that after my most recent comment. This is a very important topic, Anne Frank's ancestors. Because to understand her family properly in the attention that is received internationally, um, her ancestors, her family is identified widely as a wealthy, successful Jewish Frankfurt family that fled to Amsterdam in the 1930s, and the rest of the story with the diary. But one really needs to understand who her ancestors were prior to that Frankfurt 1930 move to Amsterdam. And there's perhaps the connections to the not just the previous few generations, but all the way back, because her ancestors made her who she was. And when we identify those earlier generations, we find actually a shockingly large number of towns and cities where the ancestors lived, far more complex than we could have imagined. Their resettlement from one town to the next raises the questions of why and how. They moved all over Germany and Western Europe at a time, and we have to ask the question, what influenced their pattern of settlement? And how does the larger family history tell us about the more complex Jewish history? It's unfortunate that this has not been explored before. And so here we go. I'm going to talk about the diversity of themes in the many exhibitions and educational programs about Anne Frank. And I have to admit that though it's a genealogy talk, I have done something that not everyone does, and that is for these purposes, I've relied on family trees that are already in existence for Anne, even though we know that some of them may be slightly flawed. And I'll show you some of those places that you might find kind of humorous. But my purpose was not to talk about how to do the genealogy, but rather what the genealogy means to us today. So I hope you'll enjoy the mistakes. And it wouldn't be a Karen Franklin talk if I didn't throw in a few stories, personal and otherwise. And so I'd like to talk just to tell you first about some research that I did and how it relates to this, even though it doesn't. I was working, as many of you know, on a television program. We were looking for many famous people to possibly use their family stories on the show. And we came upon one whom we had considered, Mel Brooks, and we thought, just for fun, my associate Esther Barberg and we went looking what was on Ancestry, what was on Genie, what was on Family Search, what was on MyHeritage, and so on and so forth. There really wasn't much about Mel Brooks' family that we could find, just not much at all. So we said, well, call it a day, check in tomorrow to go to the next level of research. And a few hours later, Esther called me up on the phone and she said, he wrote an autobiography. And it tells us genealogists that sometimes you have to look at the larger picture to get the information that you want. Now, the irony here is that Anne Frank did kind of write an autobiography, and a lot of that about her is in her diary. But in fact, she was young when she wrote it, and so she's not going to be writing about family stories that were handed down. She's writing about her personal experience in a much more limited way. So let's begin with some luck. We can begin my lecture if I can make that happen. So hold on one moment. Let's see if I can do this. Almost there. Okay, I hope that worked. Let me know if it did not. So here we go. This is one of the most iconic photographs of Anne Frank's family. It's her parents' wedding in 1925. And look at the photo very carefully. Those of you genealogists who recognize many subtle clues in what a photograph would look like. When I look at it, the first thing I see is the guy hanging from the rafters at the top, which is pretty hilarious considering what a formal photograph this is. I also notice the pompous fellow on the right, not looking at the camera. And the next thing that captures my attention is the 5 women in the front. It seems to be overpopulated by some older women in the family. So who are they? Well, it's not hard to find, because if you look at Anne's family tree, you'll see that her father had 10 aunts and uncles, but 5 uncles died young, and 5 aunts lived to a ripe old age, and presumably those are the women in the front of the photo. So before we even start, we have a little background into the family. Now, why did I decide to work on this topic? It has something to do with another project I'm working on about restituting looted books from the Nuremberg collection. Many of you may have heard me speak about that before, and it's an ongoing project. And while I was working on that project, something that really made me think was these were books looted by the Nazis from Jewish families. And when we began to identify who the descendants were, who were heirs of the books, we noticed that they were of tremendous prominence. And we worked backwards and realized that the ancestors, those who owned the books, were people of education, sometimes wealth. They had libraries, the libraries were taken. So we were able to learn something from the generations by their possessions, but also by the fact that you're going to have some of these traits handed down from generation to generation. So that's what made me want to look at Anne Frank's family and find out what were they like? What did they contribute to who she was? And there are a number of archival materials that are available, museums that have collections and so on. One of them is the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt, which was given some material from the Jewish collection in Basel, which was after Otto, but I haven't started with the Anne Frank story. I'm assuming that most of you are quite familiar with Anne Frank. And following the war, Anne Frank's father, Otto, went to Basel, where the rest of his family some of his family had settled before the war. And there were accumulated by family members thousands and thousands of letters and so on. And his personal collection is in Basel. And that's what was given to Frankfurt. Of course, we know that Amsterdam is the location of the actual attic where Anne Frank hid during most of the war. Receives tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of visitors a year with its collection. Some other places, some other exhibitions of the many, many worldwide. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum has had Anne Frank exhibitions or sections. And note that even in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, it's a very simple statement. She was born in Frankfurt and moved to Amsterdam. And that's the basic story. Just to point out the breadth of exhibitions of this type throughout the world, we find in China a comfort women's museum. This was the story of the women who were sold into slavery and sex slavery during the Second World War by the Japanese. And why is there Anne Frank there? Because she's the story of a victim and a woman, and so therefore there's a connection. So I'm not going to comment on that, as she's a universal symbol of many things. But the reason also that I chose to write about her now was because her story is being told at the Center for Jewish History in New York City, which is also a place that I work. It's home of, as I'm sure you know, YIVO, Leo Baeck Institute, American Jewish Historical Society, Yeshiva University Museum, a Sephardic Center. And this is a major exhibition that has garnered world attention and tens of thousands of visitors. So moving from there, the theme of the, one of the many themes of the center's exhibition is the Holocaust itself, which was, as you can see, in other exhibitions somewhat lacking, or in this case, at the center, the concentration on the Jewish part of the story is Anne Frank's Holocaust story. She was ultimately murdered in Auschwitz. So now I'm taking a look back at her ancestors. And from the ancestry trees online, I was easily able to take Anne's ancestors on many sides of her family, shoot them straight back to the 1400s, because, as I mentioned, they had lived in Frankfurt and also in the Frankfurt ghetto in those earlier generations. Now, the caveat I mentioned, the humor I mentioned, is a family tree I found on Ancestry, which identifies her Frank ancestors as having, as including Lady E. Cecil, as being born in New York, dying in Montreal. Not. Obviously, someone had this story a little confused, but if you circumvent and make your way through some of the other family histories, you find a little bit more accurate work. And what I did find, I found a very big surprise when I began my family tree. Might not be a surprise to you, but it was to me, that Anne Frank is my 8th cousin. Now it says once removed, that's because this is actually my son's tree on Jeannie, but Anne Frank is my 8th cousin once removed. And here you can see it again in her master profile for Anne Frank, or it takes it to Anne Frank's tree. There she is. And not to be outdone, I consulted on this talk, for this talk, with Randy Schoenberg, and I have one up on him because Anne Frank is his 9th cousin. So Randy Schoenberg, I win. However, I also was curious, so I took a look, and I'm Randy Schoenberg's 11th cousin, thrice removed. So for those of you who may not know who Randy Schoenberg is, he's the lawyer who was responsible in part for the return of the Adela Bloch-Bauer painting, which is currently in New York, and it's a long restitution story. We won't go into it here, but thank you, Randy, for your assistance on this talk. And also, I'm more closely related than you are. But that being said, because the Frankfurt Jewish ghetto, as I mentioned, is so well researched, it is really no surprise that many of us whose ancestors come from Frankfurt have some connection. Now, this is quite a tree, and it's only a partial tree because I got tired. This is Anne Frank's direct ancestry tree. And the side that goes all the way back to the green on the right, that's the Frankfurt, or in part the Frankfurt branch. And the joke is, if you see the section at the bottom, that's Anne Frank's mother's family, which doesn't go back quite so far. However, those pink and purple lines, they're from the 1700s and the 1600s. This is an advantage that German Jews have, that our records are more complete. So here we go with Frankfurt. We're going to start with this side of Anne's story. This is the Frankfurt ghetto. Existed up into the 19th century, where Jews were forced to live. But it wasn't a ghetto in Frankfurt like the ghettos you might be thinking of in Łódź or Warsaw or whatever. So it was an area of Jewish life. The Jews were forced to live there for hundreds of years. However, it was a cultural and mercantile center for the Jewish community. Its residents were established, well known. Even before the last names were taken, Jews were known by the names of the houses in which they lived, which is on this long line, as you can see, the main drag of the Frankfurt ghetto, this wonderful, iconic map of Frankfurt with the Jewish ghetto so clearly delineated. This ghetto from the early Middle Ages, or mid-Middle Ages, late Middle Ages. Here's actually a photograph of what, or a depiction of what the Frankfurt ghetto looked like. As you can see, it's not little huts, it's major buildings. Now, I was also drawn to Anne's story because of my own Frankfurt connection. And now that you've seen that ancestry tree that goes way, way back, a sort of something you can hard to think about, I wanted to show you that the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt has actually, a few years ago, some buildings are being built. They discovered these original homes from the ghetto, some of which had been partly retained, were still in existence, and they actually dug them out and restored them in a building that's the second building of the Frankfurt Jewish Museum. It's the Judengasse Museum, and you can see these remains. My family is there too. But lest you think only that some very long time ago of the ghetto, I want you to listen to something. This is my family, and just about this. I think it's.
Das Licht kann sein, soll meine Stimme zu dir dringen und meine Herzenswünsche für dich. Als zweite Darbietung.
So why did I just have you listen to this record with this German voice? That was the voice of my great-grandmother, who was born in 1860 in Frankfurt, in the area that was once the Frankfurt Ghetto. And her grandmother was born in the Frankfurt Ghetto. So lest you think of the Frankfurt Ghetto in Middle Ages times, I have a direct connection. I have the voice of the grandchild of a woman who was born in the ghetto, who lived in the Frankfurt Ghetto, my great-grandfather. I have a great-grandmother, a very strong connection to that story. Now, when I began my research, I did not know this. I discovered my Frankfurt ancestors, and I have to laugh because so many of us have the story of my grandmother told us about how they lived in the little shtetl, but no one wanted to listen to her stories. I have a similar story. Apparently my great-grandmother told of her very famous ancestors, but my father was completely uninterested, and he never passed that story down to me. So the way I found out about these ancestors and about Anne's ancestors was through Eila Toledot, the burial records in Frankfurt that were put together by a man by the name of Shlomo Ettlinger in a series of dozens of books, starting in 1349 or slightly earlier, a few records from before, going back to the early to the 1800s. Books and books of indices, and this is what they look like, page by page. So when I began my own genealogy, I went from the current ancestors in the 1800s all the way back to 1349. And while I was doing my own work, I discovered that two men, this Moselman of the Storch, that was the house he lived in, and his son Liebman of the Storch, they died on the same day, on July 24th, 1349. I was curious, why did the father and son die in Frankfurt on the same day in 1349? And here is the record on Genie, which someone eventually put on, not I, showing my connection to Liebman of the Storch. How do I know this? And you can see at the bottom, someone else had identified this specific record of Liebman. And when I was very early, this is another one of the Karen stories. When I was very early on in my research, I found a book from 1929 that was translated by Henrietta's old sister, Bertha's old Levin. And in it, it tells the story of what happened in 1349. This is the Frankfurt Jewish community was completely murdered, destroyed, obliterated during the Black Death, during the plague. A Jew was accused of setting fire to the church roof, and that Jew was Liebman of the Storch, my great grandfather from 1349. It was the first time 40 years ago that I realized that there was a connection between my personal genealogy and the larger history of the Jewish people. Now, if I were starting my research now, all I'd have to do is look at JewishGen, because the Frankfurt Eila Toledot book by Ettlinger, with all of its sources, has been indexed and is on JewishGen. Now, it's incredible and unbelievable. It's a little hard to use, despite the extensive efforts of Nancy High, who did much of this work herself, to put this on the German database in JewishGen, because again, you might have to look by house name or by the town that the person came from. It's not like Julius Backrack or Hyman Stern or something like that. The names in those early decades and centuries are much harder to identify. So here's the question. If I'm descended from Liebman of the Storch, could Anne Frank also be descended from Liebman of the Storch, that man who was accused of setting fire to the church roof? At first, when I was working, I thought she might have been. I'm not sure now whether she is or not. She certainly could be. But the idea even that this connection through the centuries, the Jewish joke that all holidays are based on the same sequence. It was, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. But certainly the humor is lost a little when it comes to looking at those decades, those centuries. But it could very well be that Anne Frank is descended, and that a more detailed study would identify that. We do have, however, one of Anne's ancestors, a portrait of Susskind Stern that is now at the Jewish Museum in Frankfurt. And I think it explains here it's the oldest likeness of a extant of a Frankfurt Jew. Well, there's a lot more to this story of this. How did this portrait survive from 1671 to make it into the Frankfurt Museum today? What was its story? What was its trajectory? How did it live? How did it survive the Second World War? And there's a gentleman whose name is Ralph Stern, also a descendant, who set out, with whom I spoke, who's written about this, who set out to find the story of this. And there's a remarkable story that he identified the town, the people who owned it, and the whole story. And he went to a local newspaper and asked the question, would they publish what he had written up, his research? And the answer was, well, that's an Amsterdam story. And of course, I could have started with this little vignette because it's not an Amsterdam story. It's a story of the Jewish people. And here it is, the portrait. So where are those places I've been talking about? All throughout Germany, spread out where this family is. Well, just to give you a little hint of the many places, they're in the Rhineland-Pfalz, the Palatinate, all these towns. Now, I just took a few samplings just for the purpose of this talk, and these, for the most part, these are towns they lived in post-1700 of Anne's ancestors. From Fürth in Bavaria and Franconia, in Westphalia, and mostly these were Anne's mother's family. And by the way, notice this Julius Hollander, you might recognize his image from that original photo of the wedding. They were, and that's the area, the Rhineland, where they were living, all those little villages in Schleswig-Holstein, and we'll come back to this later, Altena and Hamburg, in Lower Saxony, in Hildesheim, in Baden-Württemberg, Buchsal, in Hessen, all these various towns, in Amsterdam, Kampen, in France. And just to get quite specific about one story, I notice here in this is the Basel webpage. It says Otto Frank was born in Germany into an assimilated family that had lived in that country for centuries. Well, technically, that may be true that it was an assimilated family, but this very brief description belies a more complicated history, which was that Otto Frank's great-grandfather was a rabbi who moved from Fürth to a small town outside of Landau, which is where the Frank family lived prior to going to Frankfurt. So here was Zacharias Frank, the great-grandfather, Anne's great-grandfather, and in the little town of Niederhochstadt, which is about 6 miles from Landau, the larger town, he was living in, I guess it's the Cantor's house. His father was the rabbi of this small village. I don't know about y'all, but I never heard about Anne Frank's rabbinic ancestry. And after they moved from the small town in Niederhachstadt to the next larger town, Landau in the Pfalz, it was on the Weinstraße. It's known in this area in that region. I actually brought back a bottle of wine from Landau, and I tell you about this Weinstraße area because, well, I'll wait for the next slide to tell you the details. It was in this larger town, Landau, that the family made the what was actually a very typical change from a small town Jewry to the larger industrial banking industry, trade, and so on and so forth. And it was the son Michael, who was Otto Frank's father, who really started into the areas where there was some wealth and success in that town. This is the photo of the very picturesque Landau, where I went in January to take that photo from Niederhachstadt with my cousin who lives in the area. The last time I was with my cousin in that area, he took me to a nearby town, which was close to a place where my family had also come from. And let's just say, if you can guess who lived down the road from where the Frank family lived and my family lived, I'll give you a hint. There's a president whose family came from southern Germany. So you can just think about that one. This is not a political talk, but here we go. That would be the really little known story of Anne Frank. Going back to her family tree, and this is when I began my research a few months ago, I did not know what the punchline, what the big reveal of the story will be. But folks, this is it. Because I discovered through Nancy High, thank you very much, Nancy, research that she had done. When I sent her Anne's tree that I had worked on, she wrote me right back and she said, wow, you have no idea. Because take a look at the ancestors you've written about that I have circled on this particular family tree. For those of you who may not know, Glickel of Hameln was a woman in the late 1600s, early 1700s. She was married and had 14 children, 13 of whom survived to adulthood. She came from a family with not a lot of means, and she and her husband were very successful in their work. She raised these children. She worked with her husband. He died. She remarried. Her second husband lost all of her money and his. She ended up in poverty in her old age. She wrote she wrote a memoir, which is a classic, one of the earliest one of its kind, about her life. And in her memoirs, she wrote about the social circle just the way we genealogists, we publish for our children and our grandchildren, and that's our goal. They should know our story. So did Glickel write about her story, her family, her friends, their social circle, the family jokes, all this, and scholars have studied it for generations to learn about Jewish life at that time. Well, guess what, folks? This isn't a Frankfurt story. This isn't an Amsterdam story. This is actually a Hamburg, Altona story, because it seems that those circles on the tree were people who were Anne Frank's ancestors who were written about in Glickel of Hameln's memoir. And here we go. Here's a Nathan Moses Spanier, and notice he is the father of Esther Hildesheim. We just saw that name. And in the memoir, and these are available actually, you can get a copy of it online if you're interested. I am sure, and a little in advance, I think about this very carefully. Anyone else who wants to explore further on this, come speak to me after you just heard these details. Okay. So at the time, Altona belonged not to Denmark, blah, blah, blah. It was Nathan Spanier. So this is Anne's ancestor, who obtained permission for Jews to live in Altona, and there he settled his son-in-law, Leib, who came from Hildesheim. Unbelievable. Unbelievable that we are learning about the details of Anne Frank's ancestors from Gluckel of Hameln's, also in a certain, you could say, diary, the two major diaries, family reflections in the Jewish world are connected to each other. And here, which I find even more fun, Gluckel is talking about her father-in-law, it's very complicated. His father-in-law tells the story about how he was betrothed to a daughter of Nathaniel Speyer. So there you go. This is not a direct ancestor. This is her ancestor's sister. And there's this hilarious story about going into town, carrying it on his back, and the misunderstanding of words and everything. We can really get into the lives of Anne's ancestors through Gluckel and Gluckel's story. And let's go back. The story I just told you about is at the bottom of the page, but then directly in the middle is an Abraham Krumbach and his wife Yachet. And let's see what Anne's diary has to say about them. She writes about her husband, the rich and Parnas Reb Abraham Krumbach, and Parnas Reb Krumbach, his father-in-law, has supported Rabbi Samuel, and so on and so forth. So I'll tell you some of these, the way she writes about some of these family members and some of her stories, you really do need a family tree to be able to understand who is related to whom and how. And I guess that is, in fact, that is the last slide I have for you. I don't want to overwhelm you, but this is really a weird one because she's writing about her husband. I'll go to more detail. My husband of blessed memory and the rich, pious Parnas, Reb Abraham Krumbach, his father-in-law. So if it's her husband's father-in-law, wouldn't that be her father? So it's kind of a weird story that she writes. Anybody who wants to help me figure out who's related to whom, how, or who would like to do further research on exactly who is in Gluckel of Hameln's book and how else it can help us reflect on Anne Frank or on this idea of family history, please feel free. I'll put it in my book. I won't credit you. I'll take all the credit, but no, just kidding. It is a PhD thesis. It is a story. It is our story ready to be written. And with that, I'll go back to Philip and see what kinds of questions you have for me. Were we able to get the chat up and running or just the question and answers?
Both were going, so we had some, I can sort of go back. We had people joining us today. Wonderful talk, by the way. I personally was enthralled throughout. Lots of very cool anecdotal, stories and just very enjoyable. So we had people tuning in from Norwalk, Connecticut, um, Ontario, Canada, Brooklyn, New York, right here, very local, Cherry Hill, Londonderry, New Hampshire, Toronto. Haifa, Israel, so all over the map, which is really cool to see people interested in this very storied this history. Um, so we had the Q&A going. Let me see the most recent question. Does the name Spanier suggest Spanish origins?
Sorry, because not everyone can see the questions and answers. Someone asked you about your ancestors. I think that's very funny.
I did see that. I did see that, but I figured I would leave that to a personal exchange. But yes, genealogy is fascinating. But yes, does the name Spaniard suggest Spanish origins?
I believe so, but I don't know for sure. It was a very common name. It was one of the major, I mean, perhaps someone else can write in the chat if you know better than I. I believe that's the case. Spanier was a major family in the ghetto in Altona and in northern Germany, and I believe in Frankfurt as well. It was an important family.
Interesting. The next question is from Christine Crawford Oppenheimer. Is the tree you developed online so we can look for it for our ancestors in it as well.
So I'm not sure which tree, Christian, you're looking at. If you, frankly, I believe the easiest way would be if you looked at Anne on Jeannie, and if you go to Anne Frank, then it will give you. You can see if you're related to Anne Frank, if you have your own Jeannie tree or a tree that includes you, to find a connection. You could also, it's hard to navigate because, as you can see from the tree that I made, there's so many different branches. So I would recommend, you're free to email me. I think, Philip, you could put my email in the chat at the end if you have questions, and we can connect. I mean, probably a better way to do it is to ask any of your questions and put them on the discussion group on JewishGen as a follow-up, because there'll be lots and lots of German experts and also genealogy experts who might be able to answer your questions better than I. Just don't tell anybody. Yeah. Okay, what's the next question?
From Barry S. Finkel, when did Jews in Germany get surnames?
Ah, that's the question that's asked. I mean, without giving you the technical details for every different region and area, it was at the beginning of the 1800s. It depended on the specific region is when they took the surnames, the end of the, yeah. So there are details that you can read about. Frankly, again, because I don't want to bore everybody, so you could just look. It's discussed endlessly on Jewish Gen discussion group, and you can use the finder in on JewishGen to get that information. And yeah.
This next question is from Joanne K. Was Anne related to Jacob Lieberman Frank Morau, the Zohorist rabbi? This is specific on the spot,
Heck
so
out of me, I would. But again, that would be Jeannie would be your best guide for that. Would be perhaps to even just look at what was his name, Zora, or whatever, and yeah, and see who his ancestors are and see if you can make the connection.
great. Yes, we have a couple more questions. The card about the cataloging of the Frankfurt Jewish cemetery lists and S. Ettlinger, is this the same man as the S. Ettinger, note the slightly different spelling, who was a professor of Jewish history at Hebrew University in the 1960s and 70s and co-edited Jewish Society Through the Ages?
The answer is I don't believe so, because Ettlinger did his work at the beginning of the 20th century and used many of the original records in Frankfurt. I mean, we are extremely respectful and thankful to him for this lifelong work that he did. There have been other works on Frankfurt Jewish life, but his is because of the many various texts that he used, various sources. It's, from what I understand, it's extremely accurate. I mean, obviously there are mistakes and everything, but he's known for having gone down every avenue of research, a Robert Caro-like review of the material from the early 20th century.
Our next question is, maybe Anne referred to her husband's father-in-law rather than as her father because he had been previously married. This is more of a comment, I feel.
Ah, there we go. Oops. No, that's what makes genealogy so much fun, is is your prior knowledge and understanding. And yes, thank you very much. That probably is the case. Appreciate the very wise thought.
Is the name Frank connected to Frankfurt?
I'd have to look it up. Actually, from my knowledge, the Franks themselves are the families that do not go back as far as some of the other branches. You recall that this Zacharias Frank's father, Abraham Frank, was from Bavaria and not from Frankfurt itself. So I believe that the Frank family itself was not from Frankfurt. It doesn't go back as far as the others.
These questions do keep popping up. So is there any indication of either Anne or Otto being aware of their rabbinic ancestry? Otto lived until about 1980, if I recall. I remember an interview late in Otto's life of him describing how assimilated his ancestors were.
I think he must have been because the connection, I don't know for sure, but the connection to Landau was very strong. The family lived in the Frank Lobsches house there in Landau, and Niederhochstadt is really 6 miles, 6 kilometers from Landau, and that family was very close. So it could be selective memory. Perhaps it wasn't important to him. I would say the reason I said in the beginning it is true, but is because he did grow up in an assimilated household. That is what he knew. He probably was not directly affected. I think this Zacharias died in 1890 something, and his father had been the rabbi in Niederhochstadt. So it might not have directly been relevant to him. He might not. He might have been aware, but it might not have been part of his zeitgeist who he was.
Hmm, interesting. There are two questions that are very similar, so I'll read the latter because I believe it is the correct one. My big revelation was that rabbinic Jews first settled in Germany from Italy in the three oldest cities, but their children scattered to France and others nearby, or other cities nearby. So I'm still curious how Jews showed up in Frankfurt.
Perhaps someone on the chat would know better than I in terms of answering that question. I mean, they came. So I have to think. So how they went, in other words, from Schum, from Speyer and the other towns to Frankfurt itself, the earliest settlers in Frankfurt. I mean, I think the first community was in 12. The first community was destroyed in 1241. So they had been there for some period of time, and I believe that but how they got from Speyer and that area to Frankfurt, or the specific first people Jews in Frankfurt, I don't know. But Speyer is not that far away. Those other towns and Worms and so on, there was a steady flow from Worms to Frankfurt. As Jews were kicked out of one place, came to the next place, and so on and so forth. And there were years when there were no Jews after 1241, and also after 1349, there were no Jews in Frankfurt for periods of time.
We have, it looks like one last question and then maybe one in the chat. But this one is, when you say that the Frank family was assimilated, does it mean Anne was not 100% Jewish? Did anyone marry a non-Jew in her family?
It's a good question. No, they still, were very Jewish, and but it's from the tree. I only went back. I did not go sideways. So certainly, there were no non-Jews in her ancestry that I could find, and certainly the ones that lived in England and Canada were mistaken. Were not related to her. Whether there were other branches of the family that aren't included in the trees that I referenced who became non-Jews or married out of the Jewish faith religion, that I don't really know. But Anne herself and her family were certainly, you can say, intrinsically Jewish. It was an important part of who they were, even though they might not have gone to synagogue every weekend.
Are you the Karen? My grandmother's maiden name was Landau. She was from Russia. Was there a connection to the town of Landau in Germany? People often were family names from the town they came from.
Yeah, there's not a connection that I know of, but of course there could have been. Landau was a very old Jewish community, but I think that would be difficult to prove.
I guess you can also see the Q&A, but someone is asking about your specific heritage and that you might be related to this anonymous attendee in the chat, saying, are you the third cousin to me and a fourth cousin to my wife? She has roots in Niederhochstadt.
So the answer to that one is, if you are wealthy, I certainly am your cousin. However, yes, I believe I am, and I would love to hear from you privately, so feel free to be in touch.
Great. And then, yeah, this last question sort of a Wikipedia reference, I suppose. This particular attendee, Victoria, if you'd like to
Oh, so
specify.
that was the answer to the question from Wikipedia.
Oh,
That's a good one. That's a good one. You can read it. I mean, I can read it. I just am too vain to put my glasses on. So it's
no,
free.
this person is clarifying, I guess, a previous question or giving an answer from the internet. It is likely that Jews were amongst the earliest inhabitants of Frankfurt on January 18th, 1074. Henry the Fourth granted the citizens and Jews of Worms, the Schum cities, and other locations, including Frankfurt, certain privileges relating to reductions in fees and import duties.
Thank you. When next time I give the talk, I will make sure I bone up on that one and have it right on my fingertips, on the tip of my tongue. So thank you, Victoria. Appreciate that.
Yes, and then another person asking about my particular genealogy, which is always fun.
You tell them, Philip. Go for it.
Philip Barsky, are you related to the Barsky family in Rockville? David went to Wooten High School with my son. These names are unfamiliar. I am from Long Island, so Rockville Center is not too far off. But yes, that is something we can also chat about privately. So,
So,
but
Philip, the answer is if you're very wealthy, yes, I'm related.
certainly, certainly. But yes, all
Yes.
right. Well, sounds good. We can wrap this up. There are a couple of things I just want to reiterate. That a follow-up email to this wonderful presentation will be sent out tomorrow or the following day with a recording, a request that you fill out a survey about the webinar, and then information on our next webinar, which I can give you a little bit of detail about. So it's on Wednesday, April 9th. The title is Bubby, Who Are You? Finding the Maiden Names in Your Family Tree. And the speaker will be Janice Sellers. Um, so yeah, that the follow-up email will be sent out. And thank you again, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Karen, for such a wonderful, informative talk. Again, it was engaging. And yeah, thank you, everyone. So, all right, take care.
Bye.